This is your host, Mark Lieberman of The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, 103.7 on your dial, and streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. My guest today is somebody I found on the internet, which I guess is how people meet people these days, particularly during the pandemic. And I was looking at articles about the current state of affairs that we have in the country. I'm doing a course on polarization and what's happening or what's not happening in the political system. And I ran across an article called "The Problem with Advocacy Groups." And my guest, Max Mastellone, who I want to thank for being on the show today. Thank you, Max.
You're welcome.
He wrote it, and I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was very good. It's something I hadn't read about or seen anybody talk about, but it seemed to match up pretty well with some of the things I've observed that suggest that while there's a lot of, quote, do-good organizations around the country, who try to do things that are socially responsible or in the public interest, but we seem to be saddled with a lot of the same problems that we've had for decades in this country, and Max has a viewpoint on it. But before we get into that, let me just let you know who Max is. Max is a self-described socialist. That name sometimes has a bad connotation if it's uttered in the wrong groups, but he's a responsible socialist. By that I mean he thinks through things. He has definite points of view, and a socialist is not necessarily a communist or a Marxist or a Leninist or some other boogeyman. It's a view of how he sees the world. And Max, you have also indicated in our discussions that you've been an activist for many, many years, but your profession for some period of time was as a clinical psychologist. So tell us a little bit about you're bringing yourself up in terms of these philosophical principles, and talk about how it was or was not related to your clinical psychology practice.
Well, I was an activist during the mid 70s, sort of what I would consider an underground activist. I was part of a radical leftist organization that had chapters in major cities around the country, and sometimes did coordinated work, coordinated actions and demonstrations and that sort of thing. This was in Philadelphia, where I lived, and we studied Marxism on a regular basis in the group, and we practiced worker organizing at factory gates, talking to workers as they came or left, handing out literature, trying to build working class consciousness among those people. This was after I had completed my PhD work in clinical psychology, and I started a part-time private practice, which I entitled the Center for Psychology in the Public Interest, because my orientation was not the typical medical model of mental health, behavioral health, but it was more socially informed, and that informed all my work as a psychologist in my practice or in salaried positions. So the activism included participating in an organization called Medical Committee for Human Rights, which also had branches in different cities. And one of the major issues that we were working at the time was, again, we were basically talking to medical students principally and trying to organize them into an activist model. And the main thing we were working on in 1975-6 was single payer healthcare. We were pushing for that that many years ago. And that struggle, as you know, still goes on. And so there were many solid physicians in that organization. We also worked with the Philadelphia Unemployment Project, which was run by a socialist prof at the University of Pennsylvania, that was, aiming to directly help unemployed people. But we went to Washington, D.C., and on major demonstrations supporting the unemployed. I remember a bus trip we took to Biloxi, Mississippi, joining folks from other cities for a major unemployment demonstration there. And so during that kind of was the last gasp of the left in the US in the mid-70s, we were doing a lot of work to that effect.
So let me ask you something, Max. First of all, you used the term the radical left, and for some people, when they hear the word radical joined up with left, I think they envision violence as part of the modality of how they advocate, which is to say, you block streets, you might have a couple of bricks, God forbid you have a Molotov cocktail. You're willing to, I'm saying some people think that amounts to using domestic violence to get the point across. I take it that's not really what you mean when you say radical left, or maybe I'm wrong.
Well, the thing is, the way I look at it, the way the real left looks at it, there are basically in the given system, in the way the system operates, in the options that the American people are given to influence their government, which is, at this point is very few options, very limited and controlled options. It comes down to reform. The way you change things is either through reform or through insurgency. There really aren't any other choices. I was trained as a scientist, as a psychologist. I was trained in the scientific method. I was trained to believe in empiricism. Something works. You can demonstrate that some behavior, some policy, something official, either it works by you measure it. That's what we do in science. We measure things, and we can tell whether you get results or you don't get results. That doesn't seem to be something that's applied to politics. Politics is never measured. Politics is never, you never determine empirically if this policy is a policy that's good for the people. It's just implemented because it can be, and it goes on, forever, pretty much. So reform has been tried in this country. The major effort, a successful effort at reform in this country was the New Deal. The New Deal, contrary to what popular belief that it was the invention of FDR, the New Deal, FDR did not come, was not a Bernie Sanders. He did not come into office as a reformer or anything of the sort, but he had sufficient sympathies beyond his capitalist grounding to pay attention to the many and powerful demonstrations that were going on in the 1920s and the 1930s into the 1940s of people who were starving, who were unemployed, who were unhoused, and even veterans from World War I that were promised bonuses. And now, in this desperate situation of the Depression, they needed that money. And they marched on Washington. They were called the Bonus Army in 1932. They marched on Washington to demand the money that they were owed. There were general strikes going on repeatedly, and smaller strikes. The pressure of all of that going on pretty much endlessly for decades was what created the reforms of the New Deal that pressured FDR to take that approach in Congress. Now, the capitalists at the time were quite concerned about all these uprisings, and they were worried that it would go too far. So some of the efforts of FDR was basically to chill out that movement and stop it at a manageable point. And so we got reforms. But as soon as we got the reform, like Social Security, like the WPA, like the many of the arts programs and all that, putting millions of people to work, that had a chilling, had a smoothing effect on the movement, and people became satisfied with that, and that kind of ended the movement. But the reforms, many of them immediately were being pulled back. The counter forces of the capitalists, the ruling elite, were trying to grab it all back, and they successfully grabbed most of the changes, most of the reforms of the New Deal were taken back. Social Security was allowed to live, but it was stunted. It was never allowed to grow and keep pace with inflation. So, they were able to keep it going, but it's still people who live only on Social Security live in poverty. So the issue really, and now, in my view, in the view of the leftists, the capitalists are far more powerful than they were at the time of the before or following the Depression.
Okay.
And had much more tight control. They controlled the media, the mass media. And so, JFK said, if you don't give people a chance to dissent peacefully, you're going to have rebellion on your hands, And I think that's how it comes down. If the government doesn't yield to the demands of the people, which are incredibly strong, you see the polls, all of Bernie Sanders' agenda is supported up the wazoo by the public, and yet none of it is coming through for the people. So,
okay. Well, let me reintroduce my guest is Max Mastellone, who has been an advocate, as he's described, for many years. He comes from, again, a clinical psychology background, earning his PhD, became active in the 70s, which, obviously was long after the New Deal legislation was implemented. And as you indicate, some of it was probably gone by that time. But let me just politely challenge a couple of things that you're saying, just so we can stimulate the conversation. it doesn't seem to me to matter too much whether FDR was planning a social welfare type agenda when he got into office, or whether he came upon it or was pressured into it. The nation was coming out of a depression, which had started before Roosevelt had gotten into office and was presumably mismanaged by Roosevelt's predecessor, Herbert Hoover. And for whatever reason, FDR got behind promoting, as you say, a number of New Deal measures. And those New Deal measures, if I'm recollecting this correctly, started in 1933 or thereabouts and continued on for several more years. Obviously, an intervening major event was World War II, and Roosevelt had gotten himself reelected a couple of times, not exactly a democratic move on his part to go beyond the two terms that presidents had customarily had. But in any event, well, I guess one could argue that some of the things that were part of the concept of the New Deal were meant even at their creation to be time limited. In other words, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which gave people who otherwise didn't have a job, because a lot of employers, capitalists as you refer to them, were bankrupt and they weren't hiring these people back. And so these people, were standing in bread lines, but they also wanted to have gainful employment. So the CCC, which was responsible for building roads and national parks and so on and so forth, I don't think anybody ever assumed at the time that that was going to be a permanent fixture. So the fact that some of those programs didn't continue on for decades afterwards, I don't think suggests that they were pulled back because the so-called capitalists, as you described them, were against them. But there were certainly a lot of corporate a lot of companies, a lot of capitalist entrepreneurs, however you refer to them, who said, we don't want this to go too far because we want workers to work in our plants, and we want workers to build things for us that give us, that create a profit and create an incentive for growing these industries. But tell me how you see all that.
First of all, the workers that were employed by the government were not taken from business and industry. Like you said, some of those companies went kaput. But what did happen was the World War, was the US entering the war, and basically that might be the only time in the history of the country that we had full employment, actual full employment, okay? And so that made the CCC and the WPA and what have you less necessary. So there was full employment. Then the war ended, and there was a kind of a continuation of the prosperity because people got to go to school on the GI Bill, which was a huge part of building the middle class, and industry that developed through the war employed more people, but that all came to an end. I mean, the full employment situation didn't last all that long, and then we went back to unemployment and poverty, and they didn't reinstitute what is now being called for by the modern monetary economists, the federal job guarantee, which is a program that would employ every person who's willing and able to work at a living wage, with benefits. That's the current program that's being proposed to basically end unemployment and to essentially put a huge dent in poverty. Now, there's a counter argument, people talking about a guaranteed income, which is a favorable proposition. We don't need to go into that today, but a favorable proposition for the capitalists, because it helps them and it doesn't give work to anybody.
So let me stop you for a second, if I could, Max. Again, for clarification, socialism, social welfare, social legislation, many, more so probably on the right than on the left, would argue that this country has become more socialist through the years. The Republicans will blame that on the Democrats and say it's a bad thing. We know that there are countries in Western Europe who are capitalist countries, which is to say that they encourage, support, and permit capitalism to thrive. There are private companies that make profits. They employ people, but they also distribute their profits to shareholders and the like, and handsomely in very many cases. Does your philosophy about, again, why things don't seem to be working very well for the working class, does that basically say that your view of it is capitalism doesn't work at all to do the things it should be doing? Or are you saying that something about the way capitalism is practiced, for example, in this country, is not working? What's your view of that?
No, I mean, capitalism does exactly what it should do for capitalists. But it doesn't do anything for the country. It doesn't put unemployed people to work. Capitalism actually creates unemployment. It requires unemployment in order to keep wages down. You have to have a kind of a stock of unemployed people that can be drawn on, who will compete for jobs at lower wages. And so unemployment is a tactic of capitalism. And so you can't expect capitalists to employ everybody, because it goes against their benefit. So poverty is totally ignored in this country. It is, we're taught to assume that, poverty is the result of people's own bad upbringing or bad,
Not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps is the common expression. But I want to stop you for a second.
Yeah.
Because to my way of thinking, and I'm not an advocate for any particular point of view on this show, I think you're making, you're equating poverty and unemployment. Now, obviously, if somebody is unemployed, then for any length of time, and they have not accumulated savings, they are poor or they will become poor. But I want to challenge again some of your basic assertions. For many years, the so-called unemployment rate, which is measured by the government, which some people say is not an accurate depiction of, quote, actual unemployment, because it doesn't take into account people who aren't working because they just haven't been working for a long time, and those folks are the chronically unemployed.
Well, the ones that have stopped looking for work.
Stop looking. Okay. But people who are unemployed are not necessarily required to remain unemployed. They may be unemployed for a variety of reasons. But what I'm trying to suggest here is, first of all, I don't think it's a fair characterization to say that capitalism only works for the capitalists. The concept of capitalism, as I understand it, is that there is an incentive for companies organizing typically as corporations, but now, they're LLCs or whatever the heck, to invest capital or put their capital at risk or at risk by the investors to create, let's just say, a plant or to create a store or to create something, a hotel. Now, their objective, obviously, if not altruistic, is they want to make money off of it. They think that if they build a plant in a particular location, or they build a 30-story hotel, they'll charge enough hotel rates to make money for themselves and their investors. But they are also, by definition, having to depend upon workers to provide services in order to keep those businesses alive. Now, as you suggest, if there is a significant rate of unemployment and there's more people than can fill those jobs, or if the jobs get bid down to a low number, that seems to me to be a separate issue. But I'm challenging the point you're making, or that I'm thinking you're making, which is that because a corporation is set up as a for-profit enterprise, which creates wealth for the founders of the corporation and the managerial class, that necessarily means that the people that get employed don't get something good out of it. So some companies pay well, some companies don't pay so well. But the concept, I think, that a capitalist would say is, if somebody feels like they could do better at another job, they have the privilege of leaving and going someplace else. And before I stop talking, I will in a second, I talked to you about Shark Tank, which, is the quintessential, it's basically a showpiece to say, see, here are people who were working a 9-to-5 job or couldn't do what they needed to do. They were working for somebody else, and they had an idea, and they decided they were going to sell that idea and get some money from these rich investors who are capitalists and help them start their business. And they would retain enough ownership of the company to do well by themselves. So isn't it possible to have working class folk who are not victimized and held down and still have companies that, start up, make money for the investors, and then move on to other benefits, presumably to society?
Well, it's theoretically possible, but I think what you have to do is look at the results. What is society like? What is the condition of our society and the people? Over the last 40 years or so, the middle class has been devastated. The people that used to, maybe your father, your parents, mine for sure, they had one job. They had owned a house. They could put their kids through school. They weren't struggling under this massive oppressive situation where many have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to kind of survive. And so there isn't any results. There isn't any benefit that comes down from capitalism that benefits the masses of people. Sure, some people are able to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but that's a rare situation. That isn't the norm. That isn't, you're not talking about the millions upon millions of people who are either unemployed or living in poverty. And of course, poverty is not only unemployment, but there sure is a tremendous overlap.
Well, let me give you another example, and I'll try to make my comments brief so you can respond. During the so-called pandemic or COVID, one thing that occurred is a lot of businesses that depended upon lower wage employees, service employees, working in restaurants, working in hotels, working in the checkout counter for a grocery store, working in hotels. Those companies were not able, even as the pandemic slowed in spurts, were not able to attract people back to the workplace. Now, some people would say, well, it's because those people didn't want to work, which doesn't seem like a reasonable assessment. But others were forced by capitalism, presumably, to pay more money. So you go down any particular street and you'll see, all of the fast food places and the gasoline stations and others, help wanted, and they'll advertise their rates. Suddenly they're paying, instead of $9 an hour or $7 an hour, they're paying 15, they're paying 17, they're paying 18, they're paying 20. Isn't that an example of how, without in effect having the government specifically get involved to guarantee jobs or to guarantee equality or affordable wages, isn't that how capitalism is actually supposed to work well, to compete for the workforce?
But they don't. They don't, because most industry is monopoly. So they're theoretically, they tell us there's supposed to be competition in capitalism, but they don't compete with each other. They rig everything. They work together to fix what they're going to charge. They work together to fix what they're going to pay as wages. How else can you explain that the minimum wage stayed at $7.25 an hour for 10 years? $7.25 doesn't get you anything. You can't afford even at $15 an hour, you can't afford an apartment in most cities in this country. And so there is no relationship between what capitalism does and says it's doing and the reality of people's lives. There's just no relationship. And so
one of your points, and let's be clear about it, is you're saying, again, there's a lack of real choice, if I'm hearing you correctly, and you're ascribing that, in part at least, to the fact that there's some sort of a collusion, or they act in concert. Capitalists act in their own self-interest, but they act in a unified way. Now, of course, that's not exactly correct, at least on any kind of a local sense. What I'm saying is, when I go down the street, and I'm not looking for a job, of course, but if I see a fast food place, and I won't name them, and it says paying $15 an hour, some of them $17 an hour, then you pass another place, $14 an hour, $12 an hour, or and I hear stories that, again, retail shops not able to get people to work for $10 an hour are now having to, because of a shortage of workers. That suggests to me that while there may be, corporations that are stuck and would like to pay less, they still need to have workers to come in. And the only way to incent a worker to come in, there's only a few ways: pay them more money, give them more benefits, or create a theme park, in the lobby of Google or Amazon, so they'll ride the Ferris wheel half the time. I mean, there are only certain ways to incent, and they've had to resort to those.
We should feel sorry for them.
If you can't
afford to pay your workers a living wage, you do not deserve to be in business. You don't deserve to be in business. If you have to exploit people in order for you to make the money you want, if you have to put other people in a 10 down position, you shouldn't be in business. That's just not the way things should work. So I don't feel sorry for the capitalists. Why should I?
Well, I'm not suggesting, Max, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that there's not a motive here on my part, at least, to say what I'm saying is there is a sort of a sense about capitalism, from the way I've heard it explained in the courses that I took in economics, is that capitalism works because of the dynamic aspects of capitalism. By definition, capitalism doesn't require government intervention. I'm just saying, no, what I'm saying is to operate. Now, that's not to say by any stretch of the imagination that certain companies practicing capitalism don't do things that are not in the public interest. Number one, they could be paying their workers not enough. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, you had sweatshops, all across the country, but chiefly in New York, where people were paid horrible wages. They were locked up. They couldn't get anything else. But what I'm saying is the concept of capitalism that capitalists will use to defend the position is it works on its own because an individual can always say.
But where is the evidence that it's working? That's the whole thing. If the capitalism was working, then why has this country gone down the tubes over the last 45 years?
Okay, well, why don't we work on that for a second? You wrote an article, and I just want to pause for a second to give you a chance on this one. You wrote an article called "The Dilemma of the Working Class." And I'm just the first couple of sentences. The working class is the only force domestically and internationally that can defeat the ruling oligarchy and its corporate capitalist dominated government. But your article goes on to suggest it's very difficult for that to be accomplished, and it largely isn't working. So maybe you would like to use that, article or the thinking in that to explain your position.
The bottom line here that we have to talk about is power. Okay, who has power in society? The working people don't have power. What they call, what Occupy Wall Street call the 99%, have no power because they don't have the money and they don't have the political clout. So the rich people, the handful of millionaires and billionaires have basically taken over government by buying them off. Okay, and so donations is what keeps the the duopoly system in place. All right, and that duopoly serves the elite, the ruling class. Working people have no power. I've pointed out repeatedly in things I've written that, if you look at the last elections over the last 45, 50 years, you can't point to a single election, federal election, where the people of this country were able to elect a government that works primarily for them.
Okay, so let's pause for a second. First of all, let me, again, for those just tuning in, my guest today is Max Mastellone, who is an activist, a socialist, and is a prolific writer on issues of class. And I don't know, you didn't use the word warfare, but problems that the working class have in getting a fair shake, so to speak. And you just went into the other topic one of the other topics that I wanted to get into, which is you got capitalism on the one hand, which is an economic issue. And then you drifted into politics and you made use of the term duopoly. And you've written on the so-called duopoly. So to set that up, if you don't mind, Max, what you have been saying is in today's world, you turn on the television, obviously everybody's focused on the Ukraine at this point. But when we're not focused on that, we seem to be focused on the Republicans versus the Democrats, and the Democrats are saying, we're the party that speaks for the working class, the middle class, people of color, people who have had a fair shake, so to speak. And the Republicans are, those that still call themselves conservative, are only in power to support the objectives of the so-called capitalist class, the 1%ers, the 2%ers. And that's played out every day on the news, every day on television. And that seems to be, the controversy. You, if I'm understanding correctly, are saying that there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties if you actually look at it. Is that a fair characterization of the way you feel about it, Max?
The differences between the two parties are on cosmetic items. They're on insignificant items. On every significant issue of domestic and foreign policy, they're in total agreement. And the one that stands out the best is, of course, the defense budget. They're always, the president asks for X number of dollars. The duopoly Congress gives them X plus 20 million or 20 billion or whatever. It's a mythology that these parties are distinct and opponents. It's total mythology. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of the century, Eugene Debs used the term duopoly to describe.
He was a socialist.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But the reality is, if there were distinct differences, there's always people, apologists for the Democrats, making excuses for why they just can't get their stuff together. They can't deliver for the people. They say that that's what they want to do. They say that that's what they're for. But election after election after election, administration after administration, somehow they bumble, they fumble, they're stupid. I mean, these are words that Democrat supporters who are writing these articles use to say, we got to wake them up. We got to shake them. We got to get them to see the mistakes they're making. Well, the reality is that the parties are doing exactly what they want to do. They want to fool the public and to keep on voting for them, to think that something's going to change. But in the meantime, they run their own agenda, which is the agenda of the ruling class. There was a Princeton University study in 2014 that basically said this country is an oligarchy. We researched the relationship between the demands and the desires of the people, of the public, and congressional action, legislation. And there is an arbitrary relationship between what the people want and what Congress does. On the other hand, there was a very significant relationship between congressional legislation and what the 1% wants. I mean, that's data. That's empirical. What else do we need?
All right, let me ask you to pause for a second, because let's use the issue of defense spending. I don't think there's much an argument to be made about the way in which, to a large extent, Republicans and Democrats are usually it's hard to distinguish a different viewpoint with regard to defense spending. Now, a lot of that has been the case ever since what we described in the past as the Cold War, which looks like it might be beginning again, which is that everybody wants to defend this country against foreign intervention, foreign wars, things of that nature. And when more money is put into defense, that usually means that a defense contractor who might be located in New Mexico or Pennsylvania or New Jersey, suddenly that the Democratic senator or congressperson from that district says that's a great thing because there's going to be a corporation there. And usually they talk about it from the standpoint of more jobs. There'll be more jobs, and there'll also be taxes that can be collected, income taxes and sales tax and whatever. So they're in favor of it. But that's an easy one. Now, I think, however, to suggest that Republicans and Democrats basically end up delivering the same bag of goods that are not helpful to the working class, I think that's tougher if you get to some of the other issues. For example, let's just take the Biden administration. One of the key points or key policies he wanted to include his Build Back Better, which looks like it's not going to be revived, was childcare. Virtually every Republican was against having more money outlaid for childcare. The Democrats' view of it was we have to help people get back into a job You can't get back into a job if you have to take care of your children. And the cost of childcare is so high that people essentially are left in an impossible situation. Either they can't afford it, and so they can't go into the job, or they have to take part-time. It's a horrible situation. But don't you see that as an example where at least it was proposed, it was vetted, it was thought about. They had economists showing that if you pay out a little bit of money for childcare, there's big dividends. It doesn't cost more in the way of ultimate taxes. You increase the GDP and so on and so forth. That seems to be a distinction in the so-called duopoly.
But how does it play out? I mean, the reality is
we didn't get it passed.
The Democrats have the majority in the House. They have the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, and yet they can't seem to get them lined up. Why?
Because they have two Democrats that are basically supporting the Republican. You can't deny that. You've got Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. And
there's no denial of it, but you've heard of blue dogs, right? Blue dog Democrats, there's almost 30 of them in the House, and there's about 10 of them in the Senate. And the blue dogs serve a specific purpose. They give cover to the party as a whole. They provide plausible deniability. So they whip out in any, they propose these things, to make themselves look good, the Democrats, but they know they can keep them from passing by drawing out as many blue dogs as they need to turn the vote the right way for them. It's not, to me, it's no mystery. It's a strategy. That's the way the parties do work together. That one hand washes the other. The agenda is not to give anything to the people. The agenda is to privatize, to cut Medicare, to privatize Social Security, to direct more public money to private corporate hands. That is the agenda. And they know how to do it. They're very slick about it.
Let me give you another example. First of all, to make your case, you'd have to suggest that Pelosi was doing a really good acting job in trying to push the agenda of the Build Back Better, and that so was Schumer, as opposed to basically saying they tried, maybe they weren't competent, maybe they didn't have the right speaking points, maybe they didn't do it. Or another way of looking at it is they couldn't convert enough Republicans, or any Republicans for the most part, and they had holdouts. You say there's a significant number of so-called blue dogs, but the last count that I recall in terms of the Build Back Better is if Manchin and Sinema had agreed with some version of the so-called Build Back Better that included childcare, for example, as an example, then the tie vote by Kamala Harris would have carried the day, but they couldn't get those two. Yes. But I don't think other Democrats were holding back.
They didn't have to. They only needed one or two to hold back. And so they just, they don't expose themselves. They just use what they need to defeat the bill. And so they keep coming up smelling like they really wanted to do this.
So it's kabuki theater, as they say.
It absolutely is. And look, if you look at one example, you could maybe argue both ways. But look at every example over public spending, things that are good for the people over decades. They haven't delivered them. They refuse to deliver them. It isn't a matter of they can't deliver them or they don't have the money to deliver them. They refuse to deliver them because it doesn't match the agenda of their bosses in the ruling class.
Well, let's take the other example that you said was something that you were very involved in your activist days, healthcare. Yes. We know that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were trying during the Clinton administration to develop something along the lines of universal health care or Medicare for all. I'm not sure how it was actually structured. It was not all that dissimilar from what I think Mitt Romney ultimately put together for Massachusetts. But in any event, nothing happened. It blew up. And it blew up, I think, largely because the Republicans were against it. Then you get to Obama, okay, and he tried to, the best thought he could get through was Affordable Care, which only addressed the insurance issue for the most part. It only addressed making insurance more affordable for people who otherwise could not get it from their employer or could not afford it. No Republicans, not a single Republican voted in favor of that, but it was passed because they had enough Democrats to pass it. Now, again, it was only a half measure. The Republicans, after it was passed, put bill after bill after bill to try to repeal it. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said you have to take this provision out, and that fight continues even to this day. But that seemed to suggest that the Democrats and the Republicans had very different opinions about the so-called Affordable Care Act. The Republicans continue to say, if the Affordable Care Act is something bordering on socialism and we don't need the government involved, and the Democrats say something else. And then Bernie Sanders had a different idea.
Well, again, the program that were being proposed was not Medicare for all. It wasn't single payer health care. It was expanded private insurer. In other words, the private insurers got another 20 or 25 million customers. So what did it do for anybody? That wasn't the goal. So there was pressure to change something. There was pressure from the public to get something from the government, which they rarely get. And so the concession was, all right, we'll insure more people for supposedly affordable premiums, but it'll be privately, insured. So the capitalists made out like bandits.
There's no question about what ultimately became of it, despite all the shouting and grandstanding from both parties, that somehow the healthcare industry, which includes insurers, the providers, pharmacy companies, whatever, they found a way to benefit from it. But that's not to say that there wasn't a different intent on the part of the drafters, really, because I think Obama was expecting that this was the first phase, and then later there would be future changes to address some of the other healthcare issues. But who can know?
That's democratic incrementalism.
Right.
That's their approach. We'll do it a step at a time. And of course, they know that administrations will change, Congress the control will change. And so, they know that it will never really happen for the people. The people get screwed every time.
Right. So not to hopefully end on, we have another 5 minutes, not to end on a purely pessimistic note. You are committed to a lot of your principles about things aren't going well. The deck is stacked. It's the 1% or the 2%. It's the American version of oligarchy. And those things aren't working. And the two-party system doesn't work. And Bernie had the right idea, but he was not a serious, at the end of the day, let's just say he was not the candidate. What is it, if you can articulate it, is your vision of what could and should happen, and what's the takeaway for people listening to this broadcast besides it's a bad world?
Well, the takeaway is, number one, to understand how totally captured by corporations the government is, how totally captured that social institutions are, like universities, how totally captured the economy is by the corporations. I mean, you know about the revolving door. You know that the regulatory agencies that are supposed to control capitalism are totally under the spell of capitalists. The CEOs leave and go to work for the regulatory agents, then they go back to their corporation. There is no chance, there is no regulation, there is no antitrust, hasn't been since Reagan implemented. The laws are still there, they just refuse to implement them. So they do nothing to bring, and Ralph Nader screams still all the time about corporate crime and how devastating it is to the society, and that they totally get off scot-free. He's a person that needs to be listened to, but is not. So, if that capture is allowed to continue, and in a duopoly Congress, it is allowed to because they're there to enable it. So, and the media is, 6 huge corporations own 90% of all US media. So the media is totally captured. The message that people get every day on the radio and on TV and online, on social media, is the message of the government, is the message that we are wanted to have. And so without popular sovereignty, without popular activism, without people taking their power, understanding that what they have in common as working people, and they have nothing in common with the ruling class who exploits them right and left. That is the only hope. People coming to organize, coming to see their commonalities, fighting against divisions such as racial, religious, people are divided on every possible line through the media, through propaganda. So it's very hard to see the people kind of coming together and winning out. But there must be a change in the media. There must be somehow a breakthrough in where objective, honest journalism is once again, coming across to people, where there are watchdog functions, not stenography functions of the media. Without people getting the information they need to make the decisions that they should be making, it's a matter of what's going to crash first. The environment. Are we going to die because of the environment? Because nobody's doing anything about that, or is capitalism going to just crush itself, which is the direction that it's heading?
Well, I think we're going to end on a good note here, because I'm going to suggest, without patting myself on the back, that you and I are trying to do some of that job, which is this is a radio station. I don't get any money out of it. I don't have a rich contributing to it. And you obviously are doing this as an altruist, the way I would look at it. And maybe that's what we need more of. So I want to thank Max Mastellone for being on the show today and expressing his viewpoint. Very knowledgeable person. And I hope to have you back again. And we'll see if we can do something more to change the environment.
My pleasure, Mark. I do appreciate the opportunity, and keep on doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Max. You too.